The last box I packed was the one holding my son's baby pictures, and Denise stood in the doorway watching me tape it shut like she was timing me. 11 days. That's how long it took after my Luther's funeral for his wife to decide there was no more room for me in the house he'd bought her. My name is Keisha Kirkland. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I had a son, a daughter-in-law, and a home I thought I'd grow old visiting on Sundays. Now I had 2 suitcases, a folding chair someone left in the garage, and a daughter-in-law standing over me with her arms crossed like I was overstaying a favor instead of burying a child. "I'm not trying to be cold, Keisha," Denise said, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "It's just time we all move forward, different directions." Behind her, Sylvia hovered in the hallway, arms folded tighter than her daughter's, saying nothing, but her silence had weight. Every time Denise's voice softened, Sylvia's eyes narrowed like she was grading a performance. 11 days, Denise, I said. "You couldn't give me 30? "The house needs to breathe," she said. "You understand." I didn't understand. I understood that Sylvia had been in that kitchen every day since the funeral, murmuring things I wasn't meant to hear, and that somewhere between the wake and the will reading, I'd become furniture nobody wanted to keep. I carried the last box to my car myself. Nobody offered to help. Sylvia watched from the porch like a woman making sure a debt got collected in full. If you're watching this, and you've ever been pushed out of a family you helped build, drop where you're watching from. I want to know how far this reaches. I was pulling out of the driveway, gravel crunching under my tires, my chest still raw from watching that front door close behind me, when my phone rang. A Georgia number, Atlanta area code. I almost didn't answer. Grief makes you suspicious of everything, even ringtones. "Mrs. Kirkland?" A man's voice said, careful, formal. "My name is Theodore Ellery. I'm an attorney here in Atlanta. I represent the estate of a client of mine, a Mr. Winston." I sat with the engine idling. "I think you have the wrong number." "I don't believe I do, ma'am," he said. "This concerns your son." My hands went cold before my mind caught up. My son's name was Luther. I don't know any Winston. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that isn't confusion, it's caution. "Mrs. Kirkland, I'd rather explain this in person than over the phone. This isn't something I can rush through. Is there any way you could come to Atlanta? Soon. Today, if possible." "Today?" My voice cracked on the word. Why would I need to come today, for a man I don't even know? "Because," he said, slower now, like he was choosing each word to keep me from hanging up. "You need to hear this from me directly, and you need to come now." The line went quiet after that, waiting on me. And something about his tone, not urgent like an emergency, but urgent like a truth he didn't want to say twice, made my stomach fold in on itself. I pulled a receipt from my purse, the only paper I had, and wrote the address he gave me in shaking letters I could barely read back to myself. I didn't know why a stranger's voice, talking about a man I'd never heard of, made my chest ache, like it was about my own son. The building was glass and steel, taller than anything I'd ever had business walking into, and I sat in the parking deck for 6 minutes before I trusted my legs to carry me inside. I hadn't slept. I'd driven 2 hours on grief and a half-finished pack of crackers, replaying the lawyer's voice in my head. "You need to come now." Like it was a verse I couldn't stop chewing on. The receptionist on the 14th floor barely looked up before waving me toward a hallway. "Mr. Ellery's expecting you." Theodore Ellery stood when I walked in, tall, gray at the temples, his handshake careful, like he already knew I was one wrong word from breaking. His office smelled like old paper and coffee gone cold. "Mrs. Kirkland, thank you for coming so quickly." You didn't give me much choice, I said, sitting before he offered the chair. He sat across from me, folding his hands on a closed folder. I know this is disorienting. I'll do my best to walk through it carefully. Start with who Winston is, I said, because I buried my son 3 weeks ago and I don't have room in my head for strangers. Right now. Something passed over his face. Not surprise, more like a man recalculating how gently he could deliver something. I represent an estate. The client's name in all of his business dealings was Winston. That's the name on every account, every filing, every record I've handled for almost 18 years. 18 years. I repeated it slow, testing the weight of it. My son was 44. You're telling me this man's been your client since Luther was 26? I'm telling you the timeline matches, Ellery said, careful, not confirming, not denying. Say his name, I said. Say it plain. Are you telling me my son and this Winston are the same man? He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than words would have. Mrs. Kirkland, the trust instrument itself includes written instructions on how and in what order beneficiaries are to be informed. That's not me being difficult. It's a fiduciary obligation I'm legally bound to follow, the same as I was bound to attorney-client confidentiality while he was alive. That obligation doesn't simply end because he's gone. I intend to honor it, even now. I'm not trying to torture you. I'm trying to do this right, and in the order he asked me to do it. Instructed by who? By the client, he said, while he was alive, in writing, notarized alongside the trust documents themselves. My hands had started shaking again, same as they did on that receipt in my car. You keep saying client like it's easier than saying my son's name. It might be, for now, he admitted. And for the first time, his composure cracked just slightly, like even he felt the cruelty of the careful distance he was keeping. I flew. I drove 2 hours on nothing to sit in this chair, I said, my voice rising despite myself. You called me. You said I needed to come now. So whatever you've been told to hold back, I think it's time. Ellery studied me a long moment, like he was measuring whether I could take what came next. Then he reached for the folder in front of him, the one he hadn't opened since I walked in, and slid it across the desk toward me. On the tab, in plain black print, was a name, not Luther. A name I had never once heard my son use in 44 years of knowing him. I stared at the name on that folder until the letters stopped making sense, Winston, and I still hadn't touched it when Ellery finally spoke again. Before you open that, he said, I need you to understand what you're looking at. Otherwise, it won't make sense. Nothing about today makes sense, I said. Try me anyway. He opened a drawer and pulled out a second folder, thicker, spiral-bound, the kind of thing that looked like it had been assembled by an accountant, not a lawyer. He set it beside the first one, but didn't open it yet. 18 years ago, a business was formed, a warehousing operation near College Park, freight storage, logistics contracts, distribution work. It's still operating today. A warehouse, I repeated, like saying it twice would make it land differently. A profitable one, Ellery said, structured from the beginning, as the sole asset funding an irrevocable trust. I don't know what that means. It means the moment that trust was signed, your son gave up personal ownership of everything inside it. Legally, from that day forward, it belonged to the trust itself, not to him. And under Georgia's revised trust code, an irrevocable trust like this is never required to be filed with any court or recorded in any public registry the way a will or a deed would be. He paused, watching my face. That's the part that matters most here. It's not that this was hidden through deception. It's that Georgia law was never designed to make this kind of structure searchable in the first place. Anyone looking for Luther Kirkland's name would have found exactly what he owned publicly. Nothing tied to this. Not because he covered his tracks, but because the law itself doesn't require a trail to exist. I opened the spiral-bound folder myself this time. Numbers stretched down page after page. Dates, deposits, contract renewals. Years of them, going back further than I could easily count in my head. Saturdays, I said quietly, more to myself than him. Ma'am? My son drove to Atlanta every Saturday. 20 years, near enough. I used to ask him what kept pulling him down here, and he'd say work. Extra shifts. I believed him because he never gave me a reason not to. My finger stopped on a date, a deposit, a number too large for a man clocking overtime. This wasn't extra shifts. No, ma'am, it wasn't. Something in my chest that had been holding steady since the funeral finally gave way, quiet and slow. Not the loud kind of grief, but the kind that hollows a person out from the inside. My son had spent 2 decades building something the size of a small company, and he'd let me believe it was tiredness in his voice on Sunday phone calls. Not a second life, humming along 60 miles from home. Why? I said, and my voice broke on the single word. Why hide something like this? From his own mother? Ellery didn't rush to answer, and when he did, his voice had softened, like he was handing me something breakable. I think you'll understand more once I show you the rest. There are things a ledger can explain, and there are things it can't. There's more than this? I gestured at the folder like it wasn't already more than I could hold. There's one more thing, he said, standing slowly, buttoning his jacket like the moment required it. But it isn't a document. I looked up at him, my pulse loud in my own ears. Then what is it? He walked toward a cabinet against the far wall instead of answering right away. And something about the way his hand hesitated on the drawer told me that whatever he was about to hand me, it was going to hurt worse than numbers on a page ever could. Ellery pulled a single sheet from the cabinet, face down, and carried it back to the desk like it weighed more than paper should. I want to prepare you, he said, but I don't think there's a way to do that properly. So I'm just going to show you. He turned it over and slid it across to me. It was a photograph, printed on plain stock, slightly faded at the corners like it had been handled more than once before it landed in that drawer. A man stood in front of a loading dock, one hand resting on a stack of pallets, the other shading his eyes from the sun. Behind him, mounted high on the warehouse wall, a sign read, Winston Logistics in block letters. The man was my son, not a resemblance, not someone who favored him. Luther, in a company polo I'd never seen, standing in a place I never knew existed, looking more at ease than I remembered him looking in years. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My hand went to my mouth on its own, and I sat there with the photograph trembling slightly between my fingers, staring at a version of my son who had a whole life I'd never been shown a single frame of. Ellery didn't fill the silence. He didn't explain the photo, didn't rush me, didn't offer water or platitudes. He just sat across from me and let me look, the way you let someone stand at a grave for as long as they need to. I don't know how long I sat like that. Long enough that the numbers on the wall clock behind him had moved more than I expected when I finally looked up. That's him, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. That's really him. Yes, ma'am. He looks happy. The words came out strange, almost accusing, like happiness was something he owed me a report on. I don't think I'd seen him look like that since he was a boy. Ellery didn't respond to that. He let it sit, because there was nothing appropriate to add to it. I set the photograph down carefully, like it might bruise, and pressed both hands flat against the desk to steady myself. Something in me had shifted from disbelief into something heavier. Not just grief for a man I'd lost, but grief for a version of him I never got to know while he was alive. "Why?" I said, and had to stop, clear my throat, start again. Why would he hide this from everyone? From me? Ellery was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on ice. "He didn't hide it from everyone," he said finally. "Just from the people who would have taken it." The sentence landed in my chest like something cold settling into a cracked bone. "Taken it," I repeated. "Taken it from who?" Ellery's eyes flicked just briefly, toward the folder still resting between us, and then back to me, steady, patient, giving nothing away yet. "That's a longer conversation," he said, "but I don't think you need me to spell out who he was protecting this from. I think some part of you already knows." I sat with that, my mind circling back to Denise's cold voice in that doorway 11 days ago. To Sylvia, watching from the porch like a debt collector, and a name I hadn't let myself think in connection to any of this until just now. "Some part of you already knows," Ellery had said, and he was right. But knowing and hearing are two different kinds of pain, and I wasn't ready to walk into the second one yet. "Then tell me the rest," I said. "All of it. I didn't come this far to leave half-informed." Ellery nodded slowly and reached into the same cabinet, pulling out a slim binder this time, nothing like the thick ledgers before it. He set it down and opened it himself instead of sliding it across. "The business generated income well beyond what your son needed for himself," he said. "Most men in his position would have expanded, reinvested, grown it larger. Luther did something different." I looked at the binder. Names, dozens of them, organized by year, next to dollar figures and the words tuition and apprenticeship placement. "What is this?" "A fund," Ellery said. "Unofficial in name, but running for just over a decade. Scholarships and trade placements for young men aging out of foster care around East Point. 12, sometimes 15 boys a year. No press, no plaques, no board of directors taking credit." I ran my finger down the list. Dozens of names I didn't recognize. Each one a life my son had quietly reached into and steadied without ever telling a soul, including me. "He never said a word," I whispered. "Not one word about any of this." "He wasn't the type to want credit," Ellery said. "I handled the disbursements for years and never once heard him ask how the story was being told about it. He only ever asked if the money went where it was supposed to go. And now that he's gone," I said slowly, "who's supposed to keep asking that question? You?" "No, ma'am. That's not my role, and it was never meant to be." Ellery reached back into the binder and pulled a separate, thinner document forward. The trust instrument itself, a tabbed page already marked. "The trust names a successor trustee, someone with legal authority to manage its assets and direct its purpose once the original trustee is no longer able to. That designation isn't the same as being a beneficiary. It carries actual control, the power to sign, to direct disbursements, to keep something like this running day to day." He turned the page toward me, and there, typed plainly under a header I hadn't noticed before, was my own name. "He named you. Not as an honor, as a job, with legal weight behind it." Something in my chest cracked open wider, not with the shock of before, but with a strange, aching pride I didn't know how to hold next to my grief. Ellery reached into the binder's back pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet, handwritten, the paper soft at the creases, like it had been folded and unfolded more than once. "This was left with specific instructions," he said. "For you. Only you." My hands shook, taking it from him. I unfolded it slowly, And there was my son's handwriting, the same slanted print he'd used since grade school, staring back at me like it could reach through the page and hold my hand. Everything else can be taken. This can't. Keep it running, Ma. I read it 3 times before the words settled into something I could carry instead of something that just knocked me down. He wanted me to do this, I said, more to myself than to Ellery. He built all of this, hid it from everybody who might have taken it apart, and then he left it to me. Not just the money, the job, and the right to actually do it. That's how the document reads. Yes, Ellery said quietly. I folded the note back along its worn creases and pressed it flat against my palm, feeling something shift inside me that grief alone hadn't been able to move. How many, I said, looking up at him, are depending on this right now? Today? This year? How many of these boys are waiting on a payment that might not come if something happens to any of this? Ellery's expression didn't change, but something in his silence told me the number wasn't small, and that the clock on it hadn't stopped just because Luther had. I drove back to Birmingham with the note folded in my coat pocket like something alive, and by the time I pulled up to the extended stay motel I'd been living out of, I wasn't the same woman who'd left. Before I left Atlanta, Ellery had said one more thing to me, plain and deliberate. Whatever you decide to say to Denise or Sylvia, understand that anything you tell them now could resurface later, restated in ways you don't control, if this ever becomes a legal matter. Silence isn't evasive. It's protection, for now. I hadn't fully understood the weight of that until I was standing on Denise's porch again. I didn't go to the motel first, though. I went to Denise's house. She opened the door already frowning, like my presence itself was an inconvenience she hadn't budgeted for. Keisha, we already talked about this. We did, I said. I'm not here to argue about the house. Sylvia appeared behind her almost instantly, arms crossed, stationed like she'd been waiting by the window. Then why are you here? I wanted you both to know I made it to Atlanta and back safely, I said, calm, deliberate. Since neither of you asked, Denise's eyes flickered just slightly. Atlanta? For what? Business, I said simply, watching her face for the crack I knew would come. It came, small, but there, a tightening at the corner of her mouth, a glance toward Sylvia that lasted half a second too long. What kind of business would you have in Atlanta? Sylvia asked, her voice light. Too light. The kind of light that's really a blade wrapped in silk. My son's kind, I said. Turns out there was a lot about him neither of us knew. I watched that land. Denise's arms unfolded slightly, like the words had physically pushed against her. What are you talking about? I'm not here to explain myself to either of you, I said, keeping Ellery's warning close in my mind. Every word I chose now, I chose like it might be read back to me one day, in a room with a court reporter in the corner. I just wanted you to know I'm not the woman you put out on the porch 11 days ago. Things have changed. Keisha, if there's something going on, you need to tell us, Denise said, real unease in her voice instead of practiced calm. I don't need to tell you anything, I said. I didn't need to 11 days ago either, remember? You made that very clear. Sylvia's jaw tightened. Don't come here playing games with my daughter. I'm not playing anything, I said. I'm just letting you know I'm not disappearing quietly. Whatever you thought this was, it's bigger than you assumed. Denise's eyes darted to the door frame like she wanted something solid to hold on to. Bigger how? Keisha, if this is about money, it's not about money, I said. Not the way you're thinking it is. Then what way? Sylvia cut in, sharper now, the silk gone from her voice entirely. I looked at her a long moment, long enough that she shifted her weight, uncomfortable under the silence for once instead of controlling it. That's not something I owe either of you today. I turned to leave before either of them could press further. I was halfway down the walkway when I heard Sylvia's voice drop low behind the half-closed door, pitched for Denise's ears only. "She's not bluffing," Sylvia said. "You saw her face. We need to find out exactly what that woman thinks she has." I kept walking, didn't turn around, but my pulse was loud in my ears the whole drive back to the motel. 3 days passed with nothing but silence from Denise's side of things. And silence, I was learning, could be louder than any phone call. I stayed at the motel, going through what few papers Luther had left in a box in my old room before the eviction. Insurance forms, an expired passport. Nothing that hinted at Winston or Atlanta. I hadn't expected him to leave a trail. The whole point, apparently, had been that there wasn't one. On the 4th day, my phone buzzed with a voicemail I hadn't heard ring. A woman's voice, brisk, professional. "Mrs. Kirkland, this is Farah with the office of Reginald Voss, attorney at law. We're reaching out regarding the estate of your late son, Luther Kirkland. Please give us a call back at your earliest convenience." I sat with that voicemail playing twice before I understood what I was hearing. I hadn't hired an attorney. Ellery already represented the estate, or whatever piece of it I now understood. So who was Reginald Voss, and who had called him? I didn't call back. Instead, I called Ellery's office, and his assistant told me he was unavailable, but would return my call by evening. That left me sitting with the voicemail and a bad feeling I couldn't shake, the kind that sits behind the ribs and doesn't leave when you tell it to. I thought about Sylvia's voice through that half-closed door. We need to find out exactly what that woman thinks she has. And I understood all at once that this Voss wasn't calling on my behalf. He was calling on someone else's. That evening, my phone rang again, and this time it was Ellery himself. "Mrs. Kirkland, I wanted to give you a heads up before you heard it elsewhere," he said. "My office received a call today from an attorney named Reginald Voss. He was asking general questions about the estate, timeline, structure, whether there were other claimants." "He called me too," I said. "Left a voicemail. I didn't call him back." "Good," Ellery said. "I'd recommend you don't, not without me on the line. These kinds of calls are usually testing the water before something more formal follows." "Formal like what?" "Like a legal claim," he said, careful, measured, the same tone he'd used sliding that folder across his desk. "I can't say for certain who retained him or why yet, but someone is asking questions that suggest they believe there's something to contest." My stomach turned over slow, thick, like something cold settling in it. "Denise," I said, "or her mother." "I can't confirm that," Ellery said. "But given the timing, given what you told me about the conversation at the house, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't the most likely explanation." I sat on the edge of the motel bed, phone pressed to my ear, thinking about Sylvia's tight jaw, Denise's flickering eyes, the two of them huddled behind a door I'd already half heard through. "What do I do?" I asked, quieter than I meant to. "For now," Ellery said, "nothing. Let them come to us. But I wanted you prepared, because if this moves further, it won't stay quiet for long." I thanked him, hung up, and sat there a long moment with the phone warm in my palm, the voicemail from Farah still sitting unplayed a third time in my inbox, and a feeling creeping up my spine that whatever Sylvia was building on her side, it was moving faster than I'd given her credit for. Ellery asked me back to his office 2 days later. No explanation beyond, "There's something you should be present for." And I drove down with my nerves already worn thin from the Voss situation still hanging unresolved. The waiting room on the 14th floor had one other person in it when I walked in, a teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17. sitting stiff-backed in the chair nearest the window, a worn folder clutched in his lap like he was afraid someone would take it from him. He looked up when I came in, gave me a quick once-over, then looked back down at his folder. I took the seat across from him, my mind still on Sylvia and Voss, not on the boy at all. Until the receptionist called us both back at the same time. "Both of you," she said, gesturing down the hall. "Mr. Ellery will see you together." The boy and I exchanged a confused glance, and I followed him into Ellery's office. But the moment we stepped through the door, something in Ellery's face told me this wasn't the surprise I expected it to be for him. "Mrs. Kirkland," he said, "this is Elias." He said the name plainly, without a flicker of the polite confusion I'd expected from a man meeting a stranger. He knew that name already. I saw it in the way his shoulders settled, like a thing he'd been quietly bracing for had finally arrived. "I don't understand why we're both here," I said. Ellery gestured for us both to sit. Elias sat with his knees bouncing, the folder still gripped tight. "My payments stopped," Elias said, before Ellery could speak, his voice tight, defensive. "For years, money's come every month for my schooling. Then it just stopped. I found this in my mother's old papers." He pulled out a faded wire confirmation. Name on it says Winston. I called the bank. They wouldn't tell me anything, but the reference had this firm's name on it. So I came. "I know," Ellery said quietly. Elias froze. You know? You know who I am?" "I've known your name since you were 7 years old," Ellery said. "I've administered your support since your mother first agreed to the arrangement. I was instructed never to contact you or explain anything unless you came looking yourself. I gave my word on that, and I kept it, even when it wasn't easy to." The room went very still. "Then you knew this whole time," Elias said, his voice cracking somewhere between anger and disbelief. "You could have told me anything, and you just waited." "I was bound by your father's wishes," Ellery said. "That's not the same as being comfortable with the silence." "My father." Elias said the word like it didn't belong to him yet. "Where is he? Why isn't he the one telling me this?" Ellery's stillness deepened, the same careful stillness I recognized from the day he'd shown me that folder. "Elias, I'm sorry. There's no gentle way to say it. His name was Luther. He passed away several weeks ago." Elias went white, then red, his jaw working over words that wouldn't form. "I never even met him. Nobody told me anything. And now I don't even get the chance." He turned to me suddenly, eyes red, searching my face like he was trying to place me in all of it. "Who are you?" Ellery answered before I could find my voice. "This is your grandmother." Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute after Ellery said it. "Grandmother," Elias repeated, testing the word like it didn't fit in his mouth. "I don't have a grandmother. I don't have anybody. It's been just me since my mom passed." "It's been just me too most days," I said quietly. "Since my son passed." He looked at me a long moment, something guarded settling behind his eyes instead of softening. "How do I know this isn't some kind of setup? People come out of nowhere when there's money involved. I've seen it happen to kids at my school whose parents died. Suddenly, everybody's an uncle. Everybody's owed something." "I understand why you'd think that," I said, keeping my voice even, not reaching for him, not asking him to trust me faster than made sense. "I only learned you existed an hour before you walked into this office. I have no claim on anything of yours, and you don't owe me trust just because a lawyer said a word out loud." Ellery excused himself, murmuring something about paperwork, and left us alone in the office. "How old are you?" I asked. 17. He turned the folder over in his hands, not looking at me. My mom never said his name, not once. She'd just say, "The money's coming. Don't worry about where from," like it was some kind of rule I wasn't supposed to question. She protected you, I said. Maybe more than either of us understood until today. Protected me from what? A father who never showed up? His voice cracked on the word father. I used to think maybe he didn't know about me. Now I find out he had money enough to hide a whole company, and he still never once came to see me. I only just found out about the company myself, I said. 3 days ago, I didn't know any of this existed either. He kept it from me too. That seemed to land somewhere in him, but the guard didn't fully drop. That's convenient. You show up knowing nothing. I show up knowing nothing, and somehow we're supposed to just be family now. I'm not asking you to call me anything, I said. I'm not asking you to trust me today or this week. I'm telling you what's true, and you can decide for yourself, in your own time, what that's worth. He studied me like he was waiting for the performance to slip, and when it didn't, something in his shoulders eased just slightly. Not trust exactly, but the absence of immediate suspicion. We sat with that a while, two people who'd never met an hour ago, tied together by a man neither of us had really known the whole truth of. I wasn't ready to decide what came next out loud. It felt too soon, too much like deciding something enormous on the same day grief had cracked open twice. When Ellery came back in, he found us sitting in a quieter kind of silence than before. I need a few days, I told him, before I decide anything about how Elias fits into all this. Ellery's expression didn't shift much. I understand wanting time, Mrs. Kirkland. I do. But I have to be honest with you, I'm not sure a few days is something we still have. 3 weeks passed before anything moved. Elias started staying with me at the motel on weekends by then. Tentative, still guarded, but showing up anyway. And I'd started letting myself believe we had time to figure the rest out slowly, the way most families get to. The envelope came by courier on a Tuesday morning. Thick, official. My name spelled out in full on the front like it was already evidence of something. I sat at the little table in my motel room and read the words twice before they made sense. Petition to contest trust. Fulton County Superior Court. Denise's name was listed as petitioner. Beneath it, a claim of undue influence in the trust's creation. My hands went cold reading it, the same cold they'd gone the day Ellery first called me about a man named Winston. I called him before I'd even finished reading the last page. I received something, I said. A filing. Denise is contesting the trust. I was about to call you, Ellery said. I received notice this morning as well. Undue influence, I read off the page. They're saying someone influenced Luther into creating this. Who? Me? You? The filing doesn't name a specific party outright, Ellery said. It alleges influence by an unnamed individual close to your son at the time the trust was formed. It's vague by design. That's often how these begin. Can they win this? My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Legally, it's thin, Ellery said. Your son was 26, financially independent, showed no signs of impairment or dependency on anyone at the time this was created. There's no caregiver relationship here, no evidence of vulnerability. A claim like this typically requires exactly that kind of foundation, and I don't see it in what they filed. Then why file it at all? Ellery paused, and I could hear him choosing his words with the same care he'd used the day he first slid that folder across his desk. Because a filing like this isn't only about winning. It's about forcing everything into discovery. Every record, every disbursement, every name attached to this trust becomes something they're legally entitled to examine. My stomach dropped. Elias. Yes, Ellery said quietly. If this proceeds, his existence becomes part of the public record. There's no way around that once discovery is compelled. I sat with the phone against my ear, staring at Denise's name typed neatly at the top of the page, and something in me went sharp and still, the grief burning down into something with edges. My own phone buzzed with another call before I'd even hung up with Ellery, Denise's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me. Keisha. Her voice was tight, uneven, nothing like the smooth, rehearsed tone from the porch 11 days after the funeral. I need you to know this wasn't fully my idea. Your name's on it, Denise. My mother said we're not trying to win anything, she said, rushed, like she needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. She said we just need to see what's actually there, what you're hiding. That's what she told me, word for word. And you believed that was reason enough to drag my grandson's name into a courtroom? I said, and the word grandson left my mouth before I'd even decided to claim it out loud. Denise went quiet on the line, and in that silence, I understood Sylvia had already gotten exactly what she wanted. Not a win, just a door forced open, whether Denise fully wanted it opened or not. Ellery filed a motion to dismiss within the week, arguing plainly that Denise's petition had no real legal foundation to stand on. I've laid out the timeline, he told me over the phone. Your son was 26, financially independent, no dependency on anyone, no vulnerability for someone to exploit. There's no undue influence claim without that. So it's over? I asked, allowing myself the smallest breath of relief. Not quite, he said. The judge narrowed the scope rather than dismissing it outright. They're permitted to proceed, but only far enough to identify this unnamed party they claim influenced Luther. If they can't produce a real person and real evidence, it collapses on its own. I should have felt steadier hearing that. Instead, something in his tone told me there was more. What aren't you saying? Ellery exhaled slowly. Denise's attorney submitted something in the preliminary filings. Records showing the trust's distribution schedule was quietly revised about a year into your son's marriage, right around a stretch of time you may remember him mentioning tension at home. And they've noted Luther never brought in independent counsel of his own to review my advice at any point. No second opinion, no outside attorney checking my work. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit down on the edge of the motel bed. What does that mean? That you did something wrong? No, Ellery said, firm, without hesitation. It means I'm the only attorney who ever touched this file, which is common for a private client of modest complexity, not unusual on its own. But they're trying to build a picture. A young man, isolated during a hard year in his marriage, revising his affairs with only one advisor whispering in his ear, no one else to check whether that advice served him or served someone else. Served who? You? That's the implication they're reaching for, yes, Ellery said. It's a thin thread, but it's a thread. Enough to argue I should be questioned directly about my role rather than just the timeline of documents. I sat with that fear heavy in my chest. The first time since this began that I genuinely doubted whether any of it would hold. Elias was staying with me by then, in the second bed of my motel room, temporary until we figured out something steadier. He'd been quiet in the doorway longer than I realized, and when I hung up, he spoke before I could compose myself. I heard some of that, he said, about the case, about me being part of it now. Elias. Am I making this harder for you? He asked, his voice plain, exposed worry instead of his usual guard. If my name being in this is what's putting the whole thing at risk, maybe I shouldn't be here. You are not a burden, I said, sharper than I meant to. You are my grandson. Whatever risk exists here isn't because of you. It's because people who never earned anything are trying to take something that isn't theirs. He didn't answer, just nodded, unconvinced but willing to sit with it a while longer. My phone rang again before either of us could say more. Ellery's name on the screen. There's one more development, he said, his voice tighter than before. Denise's attorney just filed notice. They intend to depose me directly, about the timing, and about why Luther never sought outside counsel. The deposition was held in a conference room 2 floors below Ellery's office. Long table, court reporter in the corner, everything about it colder than I expected a room to feel in Georgia in July. I sat beside Ellery while Denise's attorney walked him through the distribution records line by line, his questions sharp, fishing for a crack that wasn't there. The distribution schedule was revised roughly a year into Mr. Kirkland's marriage, the attorney said. Around a period you yourself have suggested was difficult for him. Explain that timing. Minor administrative revisions like that happen routinely across the life of a trust, Ellery said, unbothered, his voice the same measured tone I'd come to expect. Distribution schedules get adjusted for tax timing, disbursement cadence, operational needs of the underlying business. This particular revision predates any dispute by well over a decade. There was nothing for me to be protecting him from at the time, because nothing was being contested. And no independent counsel ever reviewed your advice, the attorney pressed. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Not convenient, Ellery said. Common, for a client of his size and privacy needs. I'd be happy to produce comparable single counsel arrangements from other client files if the court requires it. The attorney had nothing to follow that with, and I watched the theory collapse in real time, exactly the way Ellery had promised it would. Denise's attorney turned next to Elias's file, pressing Ellery on how paternity had ever been confirmed in the first place, clearly hoping to cast the whole arrangement as assumption rather than fact. Mr. Kirkland provided documentation when the support arrangement was established, Ellery said, including results from a paternity test he requested himself years before his death, entirely independent of anything happening in this courtroom today. He paused, then added, and when the court narrowed this case to the question of an unnamed influencing party, the judge ordered an independent confirmation test as a condition of allowing Elias's file to remain part of these proceedings. She wanted no ambiguity left for either side to exploit later. That test was completed last month. The results were consistent with the original documentation. The attorney had no response prepared for that either, and I watched him glance down at notes that clearly hadn't accounted for it. Denise's deposition came after lunch, and it was a different kind of unraveling entirely. Her own attorney asked what she knew, when, about the trust, about Winston Logistics, about any of it during her marriage. I didn't know any of it, she said, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. Not the business, not the trust, not... She stopped, glanced briefly toward me, then away. Not any child. Sylvia, seated behind her, shifted hard enough in her chair that the sound carried. Denise didn't look back at her mother, not once. By the time the ledgers, the foundation disbursements, and Elias's file were formally entered into the record, the room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the tension of the morning. Afterward, in the hallway, Sylvia strode ahead toward the elevators without a word, and Denise lingered a moment near me, alone, out of her mother's earshot. Keisha, she said quiet, none of the porch coldness left in her voice. I meant what I said in there. I didn't know. Any of it. Not the money, not your grandson. If I had known, 11 days would never have happened the way it did. I studied her face and found something there I hadn't expected to find. Not performance, not strategy, just plain regret. I believe you, I said, and meant it. She nodded once, tight, and walked toward the elevators where Sylvia was already waiting, watching us both like she suspected exactly the kind of conversation she'd missed. 3 days later, the court clerk's office called Ellery with a hearing date, and Ellery called me the same afternoon. The judge reviewed the discovery record, he said. Off the record, her clerk indicated the case looks thin, very thin, but it's proceeding to a hearing regardless. She wants the unnamed party question settled formally, on the court's terms, not dismissed on paper. The Fulton County courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, quiet, in a way that made every rustle of paper sound loud. A woman named Ms. Pruitt sat near the front, introduced as Elias's court-appointed guardian ad litem, there specifically to protect his interests as a minor throughout the proceeding. She'd met with him twice already that week, gentle but thorough. And it was her recommendation that his direct testimony be taken privately in the judge's chambers rather than in open court. Given his age and the sensitivity of the paternity question, the judge said, I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Atwater's testimony will be heard in chambers, with counsel present. The gallery will hear only what's relevant from the record. Elias sat beside me in the gallery when the hearing opened, his knee bouncing the same way it had the first day I met him, and I reached over once, briefly, to still it with my hand. He didn't pull away. Denise's attorney opened with the same argument he'd been building for weeks, that Luther had been influenced by an unnamed party at 26, too young, too impressionable to have created something of this scale alone. Present your evidence of impressionability, the judge said, flat, unimpressed. Financial records showing dependency, medical records showing incapacity, testimony of isolation from family or normal decision-making. I've read your filings twice. I don't see it. The attorney faltered, shuffled papers, offered instead a vague assertion that the scale of secrecy itself suggests manipulation. Secrecy isn't manipulation, the judge said. Georgia law permits private trusts for exactly the reason your client is currently upset about, because they're private. That's not evidence of a crime. That's evidence of a legal structure functioning as intended. Ellery, when it was his turn, laid the timeline out plainly. Luther's age at the trust's creation, his financial independence at the time, the absence of any caregiver relationship for someone to have exploited. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. There is no unnamed party, Ellery said. There is a man who built something on his own, kept it private within his legal rights, and structured its future beneficiaries with clear, documented intent. When it was my turn, I testified plainly that I hadn't known about the trust, the alias, or the foundation until after my son's death, that I hadn't influenced any of it, that everything I now knew I'd learned in that office on Peachtree, same as anyone else would have. Did you ever suspect your son was hiding assets prior to his death? Denise's attorney asked me, reaching for something, anything. I suspected he was hiding something, I said. I didn't know it was this. I thought, if anything, there was another woman. I was wrong about the shape of it. I wasn't wrong that he was protecting something. The attorney had no follow-up for that. By the time Elias returned from chambers, pale but composed, and took his seat beside me again, the judge had heard enough to close the proceeding for the day. I'll review the full record, she said, including this afternoon's testimony. I intend to rule within the week. Elias exhaled beside me like he'd been holding his breath the entire hearing, and I reached for his hand again. This time, not to still it, just to hold it. The call came on a Thursday morning, Ellery's voice steadier than I'd heard it in weeks. The judge issued her ruling. I think you should hear it from the bench yourself. Can you come in this afternoon? I sat in that same wood-paneled courtroom with Elias beside me, his hand already finding mine before the judge even took her seat, like he knew he'd need it either way. Denise sat across the aisle, Sylvia beside her, both still as statues. Sylvia's attorney stood when the judge entered, papers squared in front of him like confidence he no longer fully owned. I've reviewed the full record, the judge said, including testimony, discovery, and the documented history of the trust in question. She let that settle before continuing. The petition alleges undue influence and lack of capacity at the time the trust was created. I find no evidence supporting either claim. Mr. Kirkland was 26, financially independent, and demonstrated clear, consistent intent across nearly 2 decades of documented decisions. There is no unnamed party. There is no impressionable young man manipulated by a stranger. There is simply a private trust, legally created, legally maintained. I felt Elias's grip tighten on my hand. The petition to contest is dismissed, the judge said. The trust instrument stands exactly as executed, including its designation of Keisha Kirkland as successor trustee, a role this court did not create and has no authority to create. It was granted by the settler himself years before this dispute existed. And this court's only function today is to confirm that designation was never lawfully in question. The paternity of Elias Atwater, established independently through documentation and confirmatory testing entered into this record, is likewise recognized as settled fact, not a matter this court is deciding today so much as one it is simply acknowledging. Sylvia's face didn't move, but something behind her eyes did, some calculation collapsing in real time. She'd filed this to find out exactly what I had. Instead, the court had just confirmed it was mine all along, permanently, on the record, in the one place she couldn't take it back from. I didn't look at her. I looked at Denise instead. And what I found there wasn't anger or defeat. It was relief, plain and unguarded, like a woman finally set down a weight she hadn't wanted to carry in the first place. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, Sylvia walked past us without a word, her heels sharp against the tile, same as always, but quieter somehow, like even her stride had lost its certainty. Denise lingered a moment longer. "I'm glad it's settled," she said quietly, to me, not to Elias, not performing for anyone. "I mean that." "I know," I said, and let it be enough, because some reconciliations don't need more words than that. Ellery found us a few minutes later, a slim envelope in his hand, sealed, my name written across the front in Luther's familiar slanted print. "This was in his file," Ellery said. "Instructions were clear, only to be given to you once the matter was fully resolved, not before." I stared at the envelope, my son's handwriting steady and certain across the front of it, and my hands went still in a way they hadn't been since that first phone call in my car outside Denise's house. "What is it?" Elias asked, watching me. "I don't know yet," I said, turning it over once in my hands. "I haven't opened it." I waited until we were back at the motel to open it, Elias sitting across from me on the edge of the second bed, both of us quiet in a way that felt earned rather than heavy. The envelope held 2 folded pages, Luther's handwriting filling both sides, dated almost 3 years back, long before he died, long before any of us knew to look for it. "Ma, if you're reading this, it means the trust held, and the truth finally found its way to you the way I always knew it eventually would. I'm sorry for the years of Saturdays I let you believe were just work. They were work, in a way, just not the kind I could explain over Sunday, dinner. I built Winston because I needed one thing in this world that couldn't be taken, pressured, or signed away by anybody with a louder voice than mine. I watched what happened to the duplex. I watched how easily things get taken from people who love too quietly to fight back in the moment. I didn't want to fight. I wanted to build somewhere nobody was looking. If Elias ever finds his way to you, know that I never stopped thinking about him. I couldn't be the father he needed without blowing up the life I was already failing to hold together honestly. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. And you deserve that much from me, even late. Keep the foundation running, Ma. Not for me. For the ones still coming up behind him who don't have anybody building something quiet and steady for them. That was never about hiding. That was the only part of my life I ever did fully in the light, even if nobody was watching. I love you. I always did. Even on the Saturdays I couldn't say it to your face. Luther. I read it twice before I trusted my voice enough to speak. And when I looked up, Elias was watching me with the same careful stillness his father must have carried into that lawyer's office 18 years ago. "He mentions you," I said, sliding the second page toward him. "Read it yourself, when you're ready." He read it slowly, his jaw tight. And when he finished, he folded it back along the same creases, without a word, for a long moment. "I want to help run it," he finally said. "The foundation. Not just take from it. Actually run it. However that looks while I finish school." "He'd have liked that," I said. "More than liked it." 3 weeks later, I stood in the small conference room at Winston Logistics for the first time as its acknowledged steward. Elias beside me, Ellery across the table, walking us both through what came next. The boys still waiting on tuition, the ones aging out this spring, the quiet architecture Luther had built and hidden, and finally, at the end, handed to the two people he trusted to keep it standing. Denise sent a short message a few weeks after that, nothing dramatic, just an acknowledgement that she hoped Elias would be all right, and that she meant what she'd said outside that courtroom. I didn't need more than that from her. And I think she knew it too. Low money never built a legacy. Love did. And my son had more of it hidden than any of us ever knew to look for.